Good communication is essential to improve relationships. It helps to build trust, resolve conflicts, and deepen intimacy. And even the research from places like the Gottman Institute in the States shows that effective communication can significantly improve relationship satisfaction and longevity. So, when you're communicating openly and honestly with your partner, you are creating a space where both of you feel heard and valued. However, it's about more than just talking, it is about connecting. So, why is it so challenging for some men to communicate effectively? Welcome to Man Talk, a podcast of real conversations about life, your life, men's lives, and the emotional well being of men. My name is Howard Todd-Collins. I am the Director of Men and Relationships Counselling. Thank you for being here. We are going to explore what good communication actually looks like in practice. So sit back, relax, and join me for this latest episode of Man Talk. Hello, hello, hello. I hope you are well wherever you are in the world. Now, I can't see you or even hear you, but you can certainly hear me. And if you want to see me, have a look at the Instagram account or the Facebook page. There's a number of very short, brief videos with me harping on about all sorts of weird and wonderful things about men and men's emotional well-being. So if you're not following me already, check out the show notes with the details of all the socials, and maybe you'll get more of a sense of who I am and not just what I sound like, but what I look like. A very pleasant young man. Well, not so young anymore. But anyway, so if you get a chance to follow me, check me out. Man Talk with Howard is the Instagram handle and the Men and Relationships Facebook page. Now, in my experience from talking with hundreds of men and to some degree hundreds of women as well as couples, I know that many blokes struggle with communication. And I often wonder why. Some of the common themes that come up in those conversations is that we, as blokes, generally thrive on being very good problem solvers as opposed to empathetic listeners. And this is what partly creates some of the barriers in connection in an intimate relationship. So how do we break down these barriers? Let me introduce you to, let's call him Steve. Now, as you may well know from this season of the Man Talk podcasts, I'm kind of creating characters, a kind of figment of my imagination, really. But he is based on the character of hundreds of men that I've been talking to over my career. So let's call him Steve. He's a dedicated husband. He's also a father with 3 young kids. He prides himself on his problem-solving abilities. So at work, he is known for his efficiency and his really good analytical skills. Now, some of these strengths don't tend to translate very well to his personal life. So he would describe his communication style as heavily focused on offering solutions as opposed to providing emotional support, which over time has caused some significant issues in his relationship with his wife. Let's call her Emily, shall we? So Steve believed that the best way to relate to Emily, to support her the best way he can, is to help her fix her problems. So whenever she would express her feelings or concerns, he would immediately look for practical solutions, because for him, it was the most effective way to show that he cared, right? And some of the time that obviously works. But the problem that began to evolve in his relationship was that Emily was beginning to feel unsupported and not particularly heard. She often felt, and she would describe this to Steve in various ways, that she was being dismissed for her emotions and that he would very rarely value listening to her, let alone comforting her. So over this time in their relationship, this style created certainly more arguments and some degree emotional distance between the two of them. And Emily began to feel more isolated, and as did Steve. He also began to feel somewhat frustrated and confused by the disconnection in his relationship with her. So Emily began to feel unheard and unsupported, and she would often tell Steve that he wasn't meeting her needs. Steve was confused and he was frustrated, but also very deep down, he knew that his inability to simply listen and empathize was a problem that he'd experienced in his life before. So what was Steve doing? Why didn't it work? And what are the alternatives? So Steve and I began working very diligently together over a few months. He was a very keen learner. He would make notes at the end of our sessions and often would begin the session with a list of things to talk about. He was very keen to learn. So allow me to first share with you some of the ways in which he offered support to Emily that just didn't land so well. Now, whenever Emily expressed feelings of being overwhelmed in her life, particularly with juggling responsibilities of being a mother and a partner and a full-time worker, Steve would often suggest very practical solutions. So he would often say things to her like, well, why don't you create a really good to-do list to help you manage all your tasks? That sounds reasonable, right? The problem was that Emily wasn't necessarily looking for a practical solution to manage tasks. She could quite easily do that for herself. In fact, that's what she did do. But she was looking much more to Steve to acknowledge what she was feeling when she was overwhelmed, to provide her with some emotional support. The to-do list made her feel like whatever she was feeling was just being dismissed. Steve would also often offer time management techniques. He would do this with his staff at work, which worked very well. So he would recommend things like using a planner or setting reminders on her phone every time Emily talked about her stress. And very quickly, Emily began to feel like she was being fixed, or Steve was focusing on fixing her. She wanted empathy and she wanted reassurance. She didn't particularly need productivity hacks. Now, Steve and Emily, when things began to get more difficult and more overwhelming for them in their relationship, Steve would often suggest to Emily that maybe she goes to see a therapist or a counselor, particularly when she was more anxious. Now, therapy, of course, can be good. Counseling can be great. I've got a bit of a bias in that, of course. But the problem for Emily was that this made her feel less supported. She wanted to be supported by Steve first. So the suggestion itself made her feel like that Steve was pushing her problems to someone else, the counselor or the therapist, as opposed to being there for her himself. Steve also tried recommending relaxation activities, things like yoga or meditation or going for a run whenever Emily was anxious or stressed. And once again, Emily would say, that's not what I need. I can do those things on my own. I want to work through some of these things with you. So whilst the suggestions were well-intentioned, it made her feel more isolated and unsupported. Now, overall, this style of response that Steve had was very, very logical. And this may resonate with you, dear listener. Many men in particular find themselves more in a logical response. But Steve would also, and he shared this with me in my conversations, he would often find himself saying things like to Emily when she was overwhelmed, just calm down. It's not such a big deal. He would also say things like, there's just no reason to be so upset. Let's just find a solution to the problem. Or he would often say, you're overreacting. It's really not all that serious. And he would say to her when she was very overwhelmed or very emotional, let's talk later when you're not so emotional. Or he would say things like, if you were better organized, you wouldn't feel this way. So these kind of invalidating responses were basically something that Steve began to feel much more concerned about for himself. He knew there was a problem. He felt guilty about it. And he often was quite confused to know quite what to do. Now, in general, many men that I meet often default to these logical responses when dealing with emotions. that often we think that solving the problem will resolve the issue, right? The problem is that these logical responses can generally invalidate feelings. They also tend to lack empathy and then lead to more increased hurt and frustration. Now, Steve was open to the feedback, not just because he loved Emily, but also he knew deep down, ever since he can remember, that he wanted to understand more about what empathy looks like and sounds like, and to learn the skills to connect better. So he asked me very clearly, what can I do? What can I say that makes me a more effective partner? So let me take you through some of the alternative ways that Steve learned to communicate and the effect this had on his relationship with Emily, but also, quite significantly, the deep effect it had on Steve personally. Now, some of the work that Steve had to do in counseling and therapy was to really focus his attention a lot more on stepping back from his logical brain. That capacity to sort of find solutions to problems straight away. He began to realize that some of the feelings that Emily had that was quite overwhelming for her was really overwhelming him, and he would naturally default to his logical side of his brain. But he began to learn something about, first of all, calming himself down and stepping away from the logical brain, but also to learn what validation and empathy actually sounds like. What kind of things could he say that would help the relationship to move forward to some degree? So what Steve began to do, he began to recognize this natural tendency to want to provide practical solutions. So for example, instead of offering a to-do list as a suggestion, he began to learn to validate Emily's feelings. So he would actually say to Emily, I can see that you're feeling overwhelmed. I can hear that it sounds tough, because he began to get used to the sound of Emily's voice when she was stressed out, or her body language. He began to notice these things a lot more. And he would say to her, let's sit down together and let's talk about what's on your mind. And he would reassure her that he was there to support her and that they can figure things out together. Now, this kind of response helped Emily to feel much more acknowledged, but it also showed something else, that Steve was willing to be present and to be involved, as opposed to looking for some quick fixes. He also began to recognize that offering time management techniques worked well with his team at work, the people that he was responsible for. With Emily, it was a little bit different, because he began to recognize that she didn't need those kind of practical tips. He began to acknowledge the feelings that she had. So he would say, I'm sorry you're feeling stressed. I am here, but also, what is it that you need right now from me? How can I best support you right now? That's the questions that he would put in front of Emily. And it really showed empathy and the willingness to understand her, and it made her feel heard and supported. But it also opened the door for Emily to express her needs without the worry of being dismissed completely. Now, the idea of looking at professional help was something that Steve and I spoke about. And something that he began to recognize himself was this idea of looking to get professional support was something that they could actually do together. He was also part of the issue as much as anything else. He began to recognize that. So he offered the idea that maybe Emily and him would actually go and get help together. It would be beneficial to do it together, right? To work alongside each other, which again really validated Emily's feelings and reassurance, but also it kind of introduced the idea that professional help would actually help them both to understand their own style of communicating. Now, the idea and some of the experiences that Steve had when Emily would come home from work very stressed and very anxious, instead of saying, maybe go for a run, he would say, I can see it's been a tough day. Do you want to talk about it, or would you prefer some quiet time? And if you want some quiet time, I'll look after the kids and do the dinner and do the whole evening routine. Tell me what you need. I'm here for you. It gave something of a choice for Emily to talk about what she was feeling or have some time for herself. It kind of prioritized these emotional needs over these immediate practical solutions that Steve was so used to. So Steve began to learn to diffuse the need to be so logical in the way he responded. He began to really use these validation skills, really acknowledging that even though he wouldn't feel it the same way as Emily, it didn't mean that those feelings were irrelevant or invalid. They were actually really important. And it was important for Steve to keep reassuring her because he began to feel better and it built a stronger emotional connection between the two of them. So, how did it have an effect on the relationship? Well, these practical steps helped Steve to transform his style of communicating, but Emily noticed the effort that Steve was actually making, and she acknowledged that with him. Their relationship improved quite dramatically, actually. They reconnected much better. Their arguments became less frequent and certainly less intense because essentially they both felt a bit more understood and valued. Now, this change in the communication style for Steve didn't just strengthen the bond with Emily, it also created a more harmonious environment at home in the family. But this journey that Steve took himself on with, partly with me, but also in the practice of learning new skills with Emily, was obviously so essential for a healthier relationship, but it had such a huge impact on him also. And let me explain to you what that was about. Now, Steve was surprised at some of the impact of some of these changes that were being made. Initially, his conversations were with me about helping to really respond to Emily's needs, to kind of please her by making the effort to change the way he related to her. And that was his first point of call. But the more he began to practice some of these skills, he began to notice something quite significant in himself. This change from a more logical approach to a more emotional communication style, he began to experience a much more positive sense of himself. And overall, he began to realize that he was also growing personally in his own way. And he described it in a few different ways about the way this was actually occurring. So by engaging more with Emily's feelings, he was then able to connect more and understand his own emotions, right? Because this understanding helped him to identify and articulate his feelings much better. So he had a greater knowledge and insight into his own behaviors and maybe some of the motivations behind them. The more that Steve began working on accepting and expressing emotion to validate Emily's feelings, he began to feel better about himself, but also he began to realize, as many men have to realize, that their feelings are also valid and they are worth expressing as well. Now, Emily would give him the positive feedback that he needed for this kind of newfound willingness to be more open emotionally. And of course, it made him more confident and made him feel much better about himself. The other part of this skill development of emotional intelligence that we were talking about in therapy really helped him to feel more competent. So these particular skills of empathy or validating skills or statements that help him understand his partner helped him to increase something that was quite significant and actually very moving for Steve, which was more compassion and therefore more love for his partner. So he described this sense of a better balance that he was discovering between the logical brain, his stoicism and his practicality, and his emotion. So overall, he found that expressing emotions reduced his own internal stress and his anxiety that he was often holding onto. Improving your communication skills takes practice, but I think the rewards are worth it. If you can recognize aspects of Steve in you and in your relationship with your partner, have a think about the ways that you can shift yourself from offering practical solutions to providing more emotionally inclusive support. And in general, what men are beginning to realize, the more that we do that, we have a more supportive and empathetic relationship. So you can see how acknowledging feelings, being present, showing empathy are the key steps to improving communication, but certainly strengthening the connection with a partner. So here's your call to action if you consider something around this as being very relevant to you. Start to apply some of these strategies today and start to notice the difference it begins to make in your relationship. Now, if this episode really sparks your interest, check the show notes for a free guide that's now available for you. It's called Better Conversations for Blokes. There are some quick and simple ways that you can begin to look at communicating with your partner differently. And at the same time, in the show notes, there is also my latest online program. Now, it's a very brief program. It's online. It will take you about 60 minutes at the most. The course itself is called From Shutdown to Communication. I'm going to be presenting to you 4 relationship boosting strategies for blokes. It's designed to help you to improve your relationship skills with your partner. Now, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please let me know on Instagram, Man Talk with Howard. A big thank you again for listening. If you really like what you hear, tell your mates about the podcast. If you are able to, give me a review wherever you're listening to this podcast now, and I will catch you again in the next episode of Man Talk.